Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
All right, folks, we've both been gone for a little bit. Dean was at COP30. I was on vacation in Spain, which is different. But we're back, and that's so exciting. Dean's here to tell us about COP30 primarily. I could tell you about my vacation, but I think that's probably less exciting. So Dean, what was it like? Just give us the big ones, the biggest highlights.
Oh man. Okay. COP30 was like living in a bureaucrat's idea of a bouncy house. It was a big, gray, inflatable, temporary structure and incredibly bizarre, very surreal, where people were making choices about the collective future of the entire planet in the most inhospitable environment you can imagine. A wild place all around, but interesting all the same. More interesting was the People's Summit, a place where people's movements gathered. People who listened to this podcast like 3 weeks ago might remember we talked a little bit about what we were going to expect to see at COP30. So I guess now we'll talk about what we did see. But the People's Summit lived up to the hype. It was very cool and exciting. Lots of things to say about it, but I think the biggest thing is that the church showed up in a really huge way at COP30, and that was exciting to see. I mentioned I was curious about how liberation theology might kind of manifest at a place like COP30, and boy, did it ever. It really showed up, and that was neat.
Dang. That's good to hear. Everyone can go congratulate your bishops and church people for showing up and doing something. Well, what did liberation theology look like there on the ground? I'd love to know.
Okay, I'll tell you that, but first, I do have to tell you a very weird story, and I feel like it's important to say it at the beginning because there won't be any natural pivot to it later in the episode, so I have to get it out of the way.
Okay.
And I've been waiting to tell you about it for a long time. So, in Belém, the city where COP30 happened, that's the Portuguese word for Bethlehem, and the whole city is like pretty Bethlehem themed, and they have a big like special Virgin Mary, the Virgin of Nazareth, and she comes out. They do some processions with her once a year, many other times, but one big one once a year, and like 2 million people come to the city, and it's wild. The whole city shuts down. It's all very exciting. People, I guess they like, you ask the Virgin Mary for something, a new house, to fix your broken bone, whatever. And then if you get that thing, you make a little model of it, like a little house or a little bone, and then you bring it and you hold it up in the crowd as like a sign of gratitude or whatever. Anyway, it's very cool, a neat, like popular expression of Catholicism. Because I was there with the church delegation, the church, they were very excited. The Brazilians were very excited to tell us all about it, and I was excited to learn about it. We went to a museum specifically to talk about this whole situation, and it was great. But there was a really funny story about the statue of the Virgin Mary, and that is what I have to tell you about. So they bring you in there, and it's great. The Virgin Mary's great. They make a new like cape for her every year. Mantle, I guess, is the proper term. Lots of cool creativity going on. They bring you into this little museum, and first they're like trying to tell you like why this statue specifically is important in Belém. And they're like, so Brazil, was colonized by the Portuguese. And so the Portuguese had this devotion to the Virgin Mary, and they brought it with them to Brazil. And they're like, the first thing you got to know is that there's actually a really old statue that was said to be carved by Joseph, the father, the stepdad of God. And Joseph, he carved this statue of the Virgin Mary breastfeeding baby Jesus. So you go into this museum and you see this statue of Mary breastfeeding baby Jesus, which is fine. But they tell you, they're like, now Joseph, he wasn't a sculptor, he was a carpenter. So he did like kind of a bad job. So then later on, we had to like make a new one, which they did do. And they kind of gloss over a lot of the stuff that happens in between. Because I feel like, first of all, the Virgin they came up with, she's still holding baby Jesus, but she's not breastfeeding anymore. I don't know, maybe too revealing. But with translation, it's hard to tell whether it's like a joke or not. But I do like the story that like Joseph also just kind of did a bad job the first time around, so we had to make something more fitting of the Virgin Mary. And the rest of the whole museum is about how great the better statue is. But all I wanted to know more about was, what is the deal with this old breastfeeding statue? And why don't we have that around here? What, people are too cowardly in the Catholic Church. We can't handle a woman breastfeeding God, I guess. And also we can't handle the sweet, beautiful sculpture of this woodworker who doesn't know how to work with other materials. I thought it was a great, wholesome story, and I feel like they should be prouder. I feel like we should all be prouder in the church of Joseph's effort to immortalize that moment.
Okay, hang on. My Protestant brain is having a hard time with the story for a few reasons.
I can't imagine even one of them.
So the statue, the original statue of the Virgin Mary breastfeeding baby Jesus, that one is made by Joseph, like
right, Jesus's dad.
Jesus's dad, Joseph. And there's no explanation for that. It just is.
Well, I mean, what's the explanation? He made the statue. It seems pretty easy. Like, what more do you want to know about that?
Well, did it look particularly old?
It looked, I mean, old enough. Sure, why not? Yeah, it's definitely, for sure, definitely was carved by Joseph, Jesus's dad, 2,000 years ago. And I have to imagine it was sort of a perfect picture of realism, knowing all that we do about Joseph, which is obviously quite a lot from the Bible. I think it really only makes sense that we would conclude that it's authentic, the statue.
Okay. And the statue, how did it get to Brazil?
The statue got to Brazil. Okay, that part I don't really remember. And it could be the case.
I mean, that should be the least of my worries, to be honest. That's that part. You know what? I strike that from the record, please, of the podcast. I don't even want to have asked that. Okay, so it is the real statue that Joseph. Okay, but it's bad though. Is the thing is very funny.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like Joseph kind of gets a bad rap in the history of Christianity for a lot of reasons. But saying he's also a bad sculptor is kind of just, man, this guy doesn't get any breaks at all.
They did say they were like, I think they were trying to give him a pass. They were being like, this wasn't his job. And I guess, like,
I see.
For a guy it wasn't his job, he did a pretty good job. Like, he did a better job than I could have done, that's for sure. But I think they're being like, he's no Michelangelo. Like, this wasn't a table of the Virgin Mary breastfeeding Jesus. It was a sculpture.
Right. And if it were a table, we'd be floored about this thing. We would be losing our minds. We'd be freaking our beans because the table would be great because that's his job. Here's something that I'm thinking about.
Maybe he should have made a table to honor the Virgin Mary breastfeeding Jesus, although I don't know what such a table would look like, and I sort of shudder to try to imagine it in public on a podcast.
A table, a bookshelf, a chair, things that he'd be more suitable at. But here's the thing. When you are taking biblical Greek at your Christian college for the first time, one of the first things that one of the first things that you learn, though, is in the Greek New Testament, when we're referring to the job of Joseph and the job of Jesus, the word is tekton, which I've heard means like a stonemason and not a carpenter at all. So I guess that makes me feel like even more suspicious about this story. What do you think, Dean?
Yeah, I don't know, because pretty much everyone says he's a carpenter. Nobody goes around. I've never heard anybody walk around and say, Joseph, Jesus' dad, the stonemason. I've only ever heard people say Joseph the carpenter. So I feel like, I don't know, it feels like an open and shut case to me.
Yeah, but okay. All right, no, that's a good point. I didn't consider how everyone just says that. That's true. That's very funny. Did you get anything from the gift shop of this museum?
There was not, surprisingly, a gift shop from this museum, or at least not one that I could go to, but I did buy a tiny one of these Virgin Mary statues just so I could remember how important she is.
That's cool. Very good.
The chased one.
What a fantastic... The chased one. Oh, not the original one from. See, I would really want the Joseph one, to be honest. I don't want the good one.
See, That's why they don't let Protestants into these spaces, because we know you guys are freaks and you can't handle the sweet
Right.
reverence that we need. It's okay for Joseph because they had a marital bond, but the rest of us need to cover mom up.
Oh, I see. No, I guess I just want the one that Joseph wouldn't have made because Joseph had made it. That's why it's special, because the guy who did it, he's the guy who
Right.
did it. And I don't, I don't know, man. I'm really confused about this whole thing. I'm not sure about this.
Well, anyway, I just thought it was important to tell you that I did get to see a statue made by Joseph down there, and I took a picture. I'll send it to you so that you can see it. But pretty wild stuff going on in Brazil, I guess, is what I've learned.
Okay. That is wild, and I'm glad that you told me. I'm a better person for knowing, so that's great. Let's take a quick pivot, because you were correct in saying that there's no way we could have pivoted to that naturally. So let's pivot away from it unnaturally, supernaturally, some might say, because of the Joseph statue, that is. And let's talk about the things that we covered on the previous episode, and then let's just kind of do a quick check-in with our dean from the field and see where we are on these things climate-wise. Does that sound okay?
It sounds great.
Great. In case you haven't guessed, Dean went to COP and I didn't. So I'm going to be doing sort of the interviewing here, and Dean's going to be doing the sort of answering. So I have nothing really of value to gain. I have nothing really of value to add to this episode.
Or to gain. That's fine to say too. I'm not offended.
Right. Okay. Previously in the last episode, we talked about the new collective quantified goal, which was about the funding that people are putting up for both adaptation and climate action. So generally the number that we talked about was $1.3 trillion. That's the one that we were comparing to the military budgets of the United States, if you wanted to, put it in that reference. But the idea was that that collectively the COP countries would activate private capital and a bunch of other sort of means to raise $1.3 trillion every year for by 2035 to start acting on some of the big climate things. Dean, what was the finance conversation like when you were at COP? What can you tell us about that aspect of the whole thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the last few COPs have been kind of referred to as finance COPs because they had to do with different financial issues. The Loss and Damage Fund, for example. The NCQG, the New Collective Quantified Goal. Lots of talk about money in the last couple of COPs. And people seemed to think that maybe with all that talk about money kind of put to bed, they could move on to other issues, including fossil fuels and reducing emissions and all these other things. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, finance continued to be the big specter haunting COP30 the whole time. Brazil decided, in a way that I think is kind of bizarre, to not really carve out a space to discuss the financial barriers in the agenda explicitly, which meant that finance kind of came up everywhere. Like it was like the issue that was behind every other issue. So anytime countries were like, we can't do a just transition, it was because of, there's not enough money, or, we rich countries, we don't want to let poor countries off the hook or whatever, but also we're not going to give you cash to like sort yourselves out. So it was a frustrating COP because it was not supposed to be, people said, a finance COP, though. I mean, we talked about it before I left that it probably was going to be. So I think it was interesting to be there because I think there was like a lot of maybe like naive hope from certain sectors of civil society that the negotiations could kind of proceed without finance being like a big shadow over it all. But if you think about kind of, we live in a society of global capitalism and there's a huge sovereign debt crisis and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't take too much thinking to be like, okay, I guess that's going to keep holding things back until we can sort that out. So that was frustrating, but also kind of interesting to see finance get moved around in that conversation.
That is really interesting. Very frustrating that these conversations were like happening maybe less directly than they should have. What okay, the thing that I'm always interested in about COP is that the finance, ends up being kind of center stage. $1.3 trillion or 310 billion or whatever, all these big numbers about that we need to sort of mobilize different aspects of economies and countries for climate change. But the story oftentimes will just be about those numbers in particular, and like, the bigger the number, the better, success we've seen or something. But what I guess in your experience at COP, what was all the finance for? Like, what is it that people want to do with all of that money? Just, I mean, maybe you can't answer that question, but just wondering, like, what are the people at COP trying to achieve with these big funds?
Yeah, well, the UN is an interesting space because, for all its faults, and there are many, it does nevertheless have a good principle for dealing with the climate crisis, which is that there are common but differentiated responsibilities. That's the phrase that goes around. So, common because everybody has to do something about the climate crisis, and everybody has to do a just transition, everybody has to reduce emissions, etc., no matter what kind of country that you are. But the responsibility is differentiated. So, a country that doesn't emit as much is not as responsible and doesn't need to take responsibility in the same way that, the US or Europe might have to do, or Canada. So that, I think, is actually a useful principle, but it's a principle that doesn't really, like, it's not like countries just agree to that and then they do it. They take on the responsibility that they have to do. So the desire for funding, it comes from multiple sectors. Developing countries in particular say, rightly, that they need funding for all kinds of stuff. They need money to pay for loss and damage that is attributable to climate change. While we were there was another huge typhoon in the Philippines, for example, and that was kind of like part of the conversation. How are they going to pay for this? Is it going to be with like more debt, or with loans, or with grants, or whatever? So, countries that are becoming more vulnerable to climate change, they need money in order to just basically like survive that onslaught of weather effects and rebuild and do adaptation and so on. There's also money for a just transition. If you're a country that is already struggling to pay for healthcare and education and roads, or basic necessities in your country, then the idea of like transitioning away from dirty energy, if that's where you make your money, that idea just doesn't make any sense. Like, how are you supposed to fund the stuff you already can't fund? So, there's lots and lots of reasons for that money to be necessary. So I think the need is there. I mean, $1.3 trillion every year also sounds like a lot, but it's not in terms of the global economy. It's not even enough probably to meet all those goals. So I think that is a big, interesting problem. Like, we're talking about the global community and the global economy, in which certain countries have a lot more money and freedom and flexibility, and other ones don't. And even though the UN is a more democratic space, you definitely see those kind of power blocks form and kind of throw their weight around.
Yeah, that makes sense. A good description overall, I think, I guess, of like what is happening with this money, or what, the idea at least behind it is. Um, I the private finance part is always very bizarre to me. Like, how exactly would the UN or any other, or any other kind of, party involved hope to make private capital fund any of this? Like, what is the theory of change there?
Yeah, I mean, that is the theory of change. So the governments, they agreed to kick in 300 billion, and then Brazil upped it to 310 billion annually, as kind of like a show of good faith, but then nobody actually met that goal anyway. So that's already kind of crazy. Like, they can't even do it themselves, let alone motivate private capital to do it. But I think the magical thinking is like, through a variety of tools which are not usually very clear, things like, subsidies or kickbacks or tax breaks, or I don't know, whatever governments use to try to stimulate business interests, which they can do in more and less progressive ways. That's what they should do in order to mobilize private finance. Um, One interesting thing about all that, our prime minister here in Canada, Mark Carney, before he was prime minister, he actually had a role related to COP, which was basically this specifically. Like, his job was to try to basically like pull together a bunch of capital people, bankers and investors and whoever else, to motivate them to invest in green stuff and I don't know, whatever they're supposed to do to meet these COP goals. And he touted that as kind of like a big environmentalist legacy. In the end, he didn't manage to mobilize that capital himself. And then when he became prime minister, the group that he had formed disbanded, just like dissolved. So I don't know. There doesn't seem like there was a whole lot of will there to get things done. And then finally, Mark Carney himself didn't even go to COP. So, that kind of gives you like a sense of how serious that kind of appeal is.
Yeah, right. So not very serious is what I'm hearing. Sorry, I'm my journalistic integrity is on the line as I'm interviewing you and then laughing at the answers that you're giving. That's probably not good practice on my part, but I don't know what else I could do. In the previous episode, we also had talked about the Belém action mechanism, which is something that people felt optimistic about. What was the vibe about that when you were there?
Yeah, that's right. So the Belém action mechanism, if you don't remember, and why would you? It was a kind of tool or a sort of call from civil society that there needs to be some way of integrating a just transition, all the kind of challenges that are involved in it. There needs to be some means of like coming together and sorting those out. So those could be financial challenges. Maybe developing countries like we don't have the money to do a just transition. They could be technology transfer challenges, like we don't have, I don't know, whatever, solar panels or, I don't know, whatever it might be. It could also be like we don't have a developing country, let's say, we don't have a fiscal space to like sort this out. Like we need debt cancellation in order to free up resources. And then there's also other things built into it from civil society, like sharing knowledge about how to facilitate a just transition. What does it mean to make sure that people who work in fossil fuel industries, for instance, have job security or could be retrained into something else? So the idea is it was sort of an affirmation that just transition is kind of a buzzword, right? It's like, it's a thing that everybody says you got to do. Governments basically agree we have to have a just transition. But what does that really mean and what does it look like? That's like very hard to put concrete details to. So civil society said at COP30, there needs to be some kind of way of, kind of convening that space, like making sure that there's a mechanism, a conversation, a knowledge sharing, resource sharing kind of means by which countries could sort it out. And I got to tell you, when I went there, I was kind of like, not very optimistic that was going to happen. I guess because I just am a pessimist about the COP process as a whole. But it did happen in the end in an interesting way. China and the G77 countries, as they're called, they threw their weight behind it pretty early in the COP process. And then some other countries got around to it. And then finally, it was an agreed upon result at the end of COP30 that they did create a just transition mechanism, which is what the Belém action mechanism was trying to be. So that's all very interesting, and I think is like an actual institutional victory that civil society should be proud of, and it's cool to see that kind of like bubble up to decision makers. I think, like anything, the proof will be in the details of what that actually looks like and how it gets rolled out. And like anything, it's going to face all the same problems that everything else faces. Like, how do you fund the just transition, and how do you deal with like, basically telling fossil fuel companies that they should not make a profit at all, which is a pretty tall order. So, I think it's like it's not a simple victory, but I do think that it is a victory nonetheless. And that's cool to see. That's a positive outcome from COP.
Cool. At least one. That sounds good. I mean, very interesting that China was behind it from the beginning. I mean, as a place that generally has a lot of, access to green technology, I say that in quotation marks, but some good stuff, and people who could actually share it if they had that sort of means. That seems ideal.
Man, okay, this is an aside, but speaking of China, all right, so when you hear about COP, you're like reading about headlines about it and countries making decisions or whatever. When you go to COP, it's so crazy. It's like, okay, I should just describe this space because it is wild to be there. Like, you go in and it's basically a huge temporary building. It doesn't really exist. It's like, I don't know what the material is. It looks like, I mentioned earlier, it looks like a bureaucrat's bouncy house castle or whatever. It's like big, it looks like a big gray inflatable airplane hangar. And then there's just like a bunch of kind of pavilions in it, or like booths or kiosks. Like if you've ever been to like a trade show, it's kind of like that, but the trade booths are countries or like organizations, nonprofits or whatever, or businesses, all kinds of weird people who are there. But the countries are there, and they're there to like show off what they're doing for climate change. And China had this gigantic pavilion, and it was really fascinating. Like every day for a few days, there would just be lines around the China pavilion because they would just be giving out like weird, hilarious China swag. Like you could get like, I don't know, a panda bear hat, or I got like a funny magnet that is the China pavilion as a magnet. It's all very funny and silly. But they were like trying to really push a strong, like, we're here for, green energy kind of message there. That was really fascinating to be like, each country kind of gets a chance to show itself off, like to express itself and, I don't know, show up in some way at COP. China was big, a bunch of other big booths. Saudi Arabia also there, which was very funny and weird.
Right.
But the Canadian booth was extremely depressing, a very small, very square and boring space. But
was there Canadian swag?
Yeah, no Canadian swag, which really reflects our participation in the COP in general. But
wow.
Anyway, it's such a bizarre, kind of alienating and like surreal place for people to exist at all, let alone talk about climate catastrophe or whatever.
Right. Yeah. That's very interesting. Just watching from the sidelines, I know another pretty big issue, not a big issue, like the big issue that at least I really cared about was that in, I think it was COP28, 27, whichever one happened in Dubai, I think that's 28. That's when they laid the groundwork for, like the stipulation about transitioning away from fossil fuels. I know that didn't happen at this one. So do you want to talk about the fossil fuel phase out? The lack of fossil fuel phase out?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I think everybody was basically waiting for 2 weeks about how that was gonna get sorted out. The transition away from fossil fuels, it's been like a pretty complex conversation among COP in general. COP29 was also not very, like, how to put it, like, not very enthusiastic about it, to put it lightly. So then I think people felt like, well, now it's happening in Brazil and not in like Brazil has its own fossil fuel problems, but it's not like Azerbaijan or whatever. So I think people were trying to be optimistic about maybe Brazil could like really secure this in a strong way. Like, COP28 agreed to phase out fossil fuels, but the agreement was not very strong. Anyway, by the end of the 2 weeks, they did not agree. COP30 did not agree to phase out fossil fuels, and that was a huge, massive blow, I think, to the climate movement. The process is complex at COP because it's consensus based. So, like, you can just be a country or a couple countries and basically hold the entire process hostage, which is basically what happened. And there was a lot of frustration from certain countries, especially Colombia, which had a really strong, impressive voice at COP around the need to phase out fossil fuels. And when the final decision came out and there was no mention of it, there was also kind of, lots of frustration among civil society, but countries too. And Colombia and the Netherlands agreed to do like kind of their own, not exactly like COP, but a kind of like mini COP or sort of their own kind of conference or get together for countries who are willing to phase out fossil fuels to just meet and do so on their own. So, I think there's like good and bad things about that. The good thing is that there's kind of a coalition of countries who seem willing to really have that conversation in a big way, and they're not going to wait around for like, I don't know, everybody else to do it. But the bad thing about it is it also reflects the kind of breakdown of like the COP process in and of itself. And I mean, COP, for all its faults, like, it is the place where the world's governments gather to talk about climate change. And if that process can't facilitate a global phase out of fossil fuels, then like what process is,
Right.
So I think that is like a really challenging situation to kind of deal with, a bad result at the end.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess anyone taking any kind of action is usually positive, especially when it comes to climate change. But when you do see that the center is not holding, you can, you know, um, rightly raise some red flags about what's going on. Maybe more on that point, but in a different direction. We did talk last time about how the U.S. wasn't there, and that you thought, maybe that could be a gift. Was it a gift, or was it just the U.S. not being there?
Yeah, I mean, what was really interesting about that is that it was sort of a test of multilateralism. Like, how does it work without the US being at the table? And I think the sad reality of that is you also couldn't blame the US for being the holdout this time around. Like, usually when the US is there, you can kind of blame them for sabotaging a process. But in this case, we didn't have that luxury. And so what happened was, it was like, oh dang, the global community is also pretty fragmented when it comes to climate change. It's not just the US that's being the problem in the room or whatever. So that was challenging. I think people were also kind of hopeful, myself included, to be like, what's the opportunity if the US is not going to be there? But countries didn't take it.
Yeah, interesting. The other problem, I mean, the United States not being there, they're not there to sabotage. Other countries are certainly a problem, but also the glut of fossil fuel lobbyists probably didn't help anything either.
By one estimate that came out during COP, over 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists got access to COP30, which is really nuts because, according to that same analysis, fossil fuel lobbyists outnumbered almost every single country delegation at COP, with only Brazil sending more people. So, like, if the fossil fuel industry was a party at COP, they would be the second biggest block that was there, which is really pretty nuts.
That is bonkers. I'm sure a completely neutral presence. They have no agenda. They're just meeting with people and having a great time. I'm sure that's all cool. They probably saw the same statue that Joseph made, just like you did, and didn't do anything nefarious. Wild. That's a nuts number. Sorry, one more thing before we move on to talking maybe more about the People Summit and some more uplifting topics. The other thing that has definitely come out of COP, and whether it's good or not, I'll let you say. But there's also something called the Tropical Forest Forever Fund. The Amazon rainforest is obviously a big player in this COP since it's in Brazil and on the outskirts of it here. So, what is the Tropical Forest Forever Fund? Is it good? Is it bad? Tell us all the details.
Yeah, the TFFF, as they called it.
It can't be called that. That's such bad branding. Come on, guys.
Yeah,
Too many Fs.
that's what they called it. The TFFF, it's a very weird idea. It was proposed by Brazil. The short of it is, like, it's a fund, so it's a big investment fund. And the idea is that the profits of the fund would go in part back to investors in it. So that's the motivation to invest in it. You get a return in your investment. But then a chunk of it goes toward conservation efforts related to the Amazon. And then 20% of the profits go back to indigenous communities who live in the Amazon. And I mean, it's such a wild idea because it, like, premises the future of the Amazon on basically how well a speculative asset is doing, which is really bizarre. And the idea also is that governments would kind of insure the fund. So, like, if it was performing badly, then it would be underwritten by public money, which is effectively a bailout to investors. But that's what they wanted to do in order to, like, make it seem like a safe investment for private capital. So this is also part of that, mobilizing private capital to, whatever, kick in money for the climate crisis. It was such a weird scheme. Brazil, they announced it. They had, like, a funding goal for it right off the bat, which they didn't meet. Very few people ended up being excited. The UK, very famously, right before COP even started, was like, we're not doing that. Very funny. Just a complete refusal to play ball, even on their own terms, which is bizarre. So they couldn't even convince, like, I don't know, more centrist governments from the global north to participate, except for Germany kicked in a bunch of money at the end. A very weird scheme. It was pretty like present there. Like conversations around it were very present. I saw a lot of no TFFF signs all over the place in civil society folks, but in particular, there was like a really interesting contingent of Christians at the COP, many of whom were from Brazil or from Latin America more broadly, and who work on extractives, but also on like carbon markets and all these kind of like weird, I don't know, weird new problems that are coming up as a result of dealing with the climate crisis. And many of them were also wearing like no TFFF hats and stuff like that. So all that to say, like all of our friends said, don't do it. It's not good. But in addition to it being a really wild scheme, it was interesting to see like a lot of civil society, including the church, be like, we're not buying that.
Yeah, interesting. Leonardo Boff, longtime listeners of the show recognize that name, as he's a liberation theologian who lives in Brazil. He wrote a blog about COP, and the blog is interesting. I'll link it in the show notes when we post this, because it's kind of it's thinking about COP, but through the life of Chico Mendes, who's a pretty important environmental activist and also a trade unionist, somebody who's kind of bridging that gap. Very cool. He was like a rubber man in the Amazon rainforest, somebody who would tap rubber trees and harvest the rubber. Anyways, in that article from Boff, he does mention that he mentions the TFFF in a positive light, which is, I thought, was kind of surprising to me given the report back. I mean, I guess generally it could be, it's something where the capital to be mobilized, but I agree with you. That seems like a very weird scheme. I don't know, the idea that you can mobilize private capital to invest in something like that is very a very big idea, a very unlikely big idea from my perspective. So anyways, very interesting to hear that that there are other Christians there are other civil society people there who are like very against it, and they've even got hats. I would love a hat. Maybe I'll have to investigate how to get one. Yeah, I don't know. Very interesting, though. I just, man, private capital as the answer to climate change. That is an idea I cannot be sold on.
In Brazil's defense, I think that they're kind of like caught between a rock and a hard place in some ways. Like, I mean, in some ways for sure, big asterisk, but in some ways, the Amazon has always been a big problem. It's like I was talking with a Brazilian friend of mine about it. Like they have historically seen the Amazon as a kind of big, liability and big opportunity. It's like it's kind of a symbol of how development could happen. Like you press into the Amazon, you kind of like tame nature or whatever through civilization. That was like a long story in Brazil, and it's one that continued with Bolsonaro in particular, just clear cutting it and whatever, destroying it and trying to extract everything you can out of it, all that kind of stuff. So I think that the Lula government too is also like, exploring oil reserves in the Amazon, all kinds of really yucky stuff. So I think the progressive government is trying to be creative with like, could we basically create an incentive to not destroy the Amazon? Because there is an economic incentive to destroy it. So they're trying to like create a counter profit motive, I guess you could say. So that's like the innovation that they're after within a capitalist system. But, it's a bizarre situation where also like it kind of depends on just like recognizing and accepting the fragility of progressive governments, right? Because all it takes is like one right winger to get in there and then, I don't know, continue clear cutting the Amazon, or even a progressive government, I guess, to continue developing the Amazon against the kind of global interest of keeping it preserved and so on. So I can understand like the kind of challenges that they're up against, but again, I think tying the lungs of the earth to like the behavior of a speculative asset seems like trading some problems for a lot of other bad problems.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. In the Boff blog that he read about this, the Chico Mendes thing kind of makes sense. Boff is citing that Mendez was advocating for like a type of extractive reserve in the Amazon where like, you know, the rubber trees could be, I don't know, farmed and tapped, and rubber could be extracted, and like it could be used sort of as a productive asset while, you know, while giving it that type of protection as a common good. It would also create a way to like preserve the rainforest and, you know, not completely destroy it, not let it just kind of be up to the whims of capital or something. Which I guess you can see the analogy between these two things, the TFFF and like the Mendez idea, but the speculative capital part of it does it is a difference that makes a difference that I think you should probably consider a bit more. Whatever. Um, Anyways, Dean, tell us more about the People Summit. There's, I'm sure, lots of cool stuff going on there. What was it like? Was there lots of like liberation theology stuff happening, or was it just a different vibe?
Yeah, I mean, that was the exciting part. The People Summit was really fascinating. So basically, COP30, it's organized in this weird, yucky hangar of make believe. That's very inaccessible, inhospitable. The People Summit was organized at Public University. It was really an interesting space in and of itself. There was like a huge solidarity crafts market, which was really wild. So like you go there and the MST, the landless workers, they're there with a bunch of products from MST farms, which was really wild and cool. Um, and the MST makes a lot more stuff than I had ever expected. They make they make beer. You can get MST marijuana. It's just like an
Whoa.
MST product for anything. There was like I was told, I didn't see this, but apparently they make like a boxed chocolate milk, which is very funny. So anyway, they're out there doing their thing. Lots of other kind of like products, craftspeople making stuff. I don't know, whatever you could want, food, clothing, etc. I bought a great MST hat. All the usual stuff. So that was really neat. But in addition to the kind of solidarity market, beyond the consumerism of left wing ideas, there was also like a kind of counter cop in some respects. So there were all these panels organized around many different topics. Our organization organized one around debt, for example. I went to a bunch on climate finance. So the idea is that the People Summit was kind of a place to both interrogate the conversations happening at COP. So there were people discussing like what's going on there. There were a lot of people in kind of my position where like you had access to both spaces. So there were discussions about how do you like bridge those or bring the messages from the People Summit into that kind of COP space and so on. But then there was also beyond that, just sort of a lot of energy around like another world is possible. And if that's the case, how would we do it? They had this huge kind of like common declaration at the end. And the way they did it was really fascinating. They had these like dialogue sessions early in the morning where they would be organized thematically and people would just go and talk on stage in a kind of organized way. And then there was kind of synthesizing committees that put them all together. And then, you know, they had their own statement at the end. Anyway, all that to say, it was really fascinating to see like a mirror process. Like COP30, it's all these government negotiators and officials, and they're making decisions and trying to reach consensus and failing and all this kind of stuff. And then the People Summit similarly is trying to reach a consensus, to have a final statement to express like what do people want? What do the people want about you know, the climate crisis in Brazil? And that was all very hopeful. And because it was in Brazil, also lots of like interesting coexistence of everybody: trade unions, indigenous peoples, socialists, Christians, churches, etc. Everybody's kind of in the mix. And then there was also a big ecumenical kind of presence, like the Archdiocese of Belém, the Catholic diocese. They had tons of programming related to the People Summit and to the COP zone. And then there was a kind of ecumenical space that included Catholics, Anglicans, Lutherans, whoever else, non-Christians as well, kind of interfaith space, who were also reflecting on, you know, the COP and the People Summit and so on. So that was really interesting. I don't think I've ever seen like people of faith organized politically and with so much diversity in one place, probably like ever in my life. That was all really, really fascinating.
What were some of the things that I guess people were talking about in that space? What was the common vibe amongst everybody?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of discussion around the kind of like the challenging bits of the just transition question. Lots of discussion around extraction, for example. And because it was in Latin America, there was a huge presence of like the Church and Mining Network and others. There's a whole movement in Brazil called the People Affected by Dams, for example. Lots of different movements there to basically be like the green transition, hydroelectric dams, critical minerals, and so on. These kinds of projects are not without victims. They are creating new forms of violence and displacement and so on. And the church was very interested and concerned about those kinds of questions. So I think that came up quite a lot in the church space. There was also a lot of recognition of like ecological martyrs and just talking about people who had kind of given their lives in defense of people and land and so on. So that was a big piece. And I'd say the kind of rights of indigenous peoples was also a really huge, very obvious part of that conversation as well, including the church side of it. So that was all really interesting to see. Those were kind of maybe the big things boiling up to the surface there.
And great to hear. Great to hear when people of faith and I don't know, people of not faith as well can kind of like have a common vibe, a common goal. When you were away, I talked to everyone's favorite Scottish friend, William Gibson, about his recent trip to the World Communion of Reformed Churches meeting that he went to, the WCRC. And he was with all these Christians kind of internationally, and they were talking about, a lot of the things that you're mentioning here, like big things about economics and climate change and everything else. And he and I were talking on the episode about Christian unity and like how Christian unity is like a very hard thing to kind of figure out theologically, maybe, especially when you have big disagreements about, I don't know, grace and whatever else, other big theological ideas. But there is a lot of Christian unity to be found in striving towards justice, which is pretty cool, actually. Something that is like orienting for a lot of different Christians. I don't know, when you were there, was that the vibe? Like everyone, did it not really matter where you were from as long as everyone was kind of fighting for the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, that was at least my experience. Maybe others had a different one, but my experience was exactly that. The ecumenical collaboration was really interesting. Um, the Anglican Archbishop in Milan was very participatory in all of that as well. For example, I went to listen to a panel of the Churches and Mining Network held on basically like on the grounds of the Anglican, I think it was like the Anglican Cathedral or whatever the equivalent of that would be, the big Anglican church in Belém. So, there was a lot of like material sharing and so on. Some very funny pictures as well of just like, I don't know, Marxists and Catholics in the same spot and all the kind of stuff you imagine when you think about, caricatures and realities of liberation theology were kind of present in an interesting way there. It did seem like the People's Summit in particular, there are always contradictions that come up. And in fact, there were some contradictions. Like there were some hard questions, I think, around the voice of like labor with respect to fossil fuels and stuff, and the voice of indigenous peoples and so on. So, that's all part of it. But my feeling is that there was a kind of pretty unique energy of like, we have to figure out what it means to be in solidarity together, because not far away there are all these decision makers figuring out what they need to do to be together to basically deliver on something that's not enough, so I think there was a real like people's power kind of movement there that was exciting to see, and ecumenism of justice and solidarity for sure.
Nice, that's rad. Well, any other big observations or stories you want to tell to round out the episode?
Good question. Well, yeah, I think this was a really interesting COP, ultimately, as frustrating as it is, because for all the failure of the politicians to deliver, I think that the church and civil society delivered in a way that was like totally unique. It's not like that event is going to stop climate change, but I do think that it provided an opportunity to basically create connections that didn't exist before that. One example, we talked over the summer about this statement that came out from the presidents of the Latin American, Asian, and African bishops' conferences. The cardinals who are the president of those conferences were all present at COP and at the People Summit. And I got to chat with some of them. And it was interesting to hear them reflect too, like the kind of bishops and hierarchy reflect on the opportunities that were kind of manifesting over those 2 weeks. Like the hierarchy and church organizations and movements all kind of took time to like do things together, and not just like go to mass together, even though we did that, which was very cool, but to like go march in the streets together. There was like a march of 70,000 people in between the 2 weeks of COP. And, the bishops were out there along with everybody else. And I think that was really cool to see. And there was a lot of discussion too about like, what does it mean for the church to find and use its voice at a place like COP? And I think Brazil being the context makes that maybe like especially unique and probably unrepeatable in some ways. But it did raise like some important questions about like, how does the church intervene in those kinds of processes, and how does it stay close to the people as it does so, and not just like get lost in the noise of all the technical stuff that's happening in the COP30 pavilions, things like that. So I think to me, like, that's the good news about COP30, is that it didn't deliver on climate, but it did kind of like it did create like a ground for connection and encounter that didn't exist otherwise. And yeah, I mean, who knows what will come out of that. But I think whenever you get like church people and social movement people together in the same place, like that's like a really important kind of victory and something that people could build on.
That sounds really cool. Like a hopeful moment in the midst of something that sounds not that hopeful. It is very cool just to think about. I mean, we on this podcast, we read all about liberation theologians, and they're always doing things and talking about stuff. But interesting to hear that ground is still available and still kind of exists. It's not something that happened in the past. People are still out there kind of like acting on this kind of tradition and way of thinking. Kind of uplifting if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, from Joseph's weird sculpture of Mary breastfeeding Jesus to a bunch of bishops walking around in the street, alongside people with signs demanding climate justice and so on. I think it's like a pretty impressive effort to just be like, I don't know, the church could mobilize in a strong way, and at COP30, it definitely did that.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you're hearing, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you join our Patreon at even $1, you can get access to our very cool behind the paywall Discord channel where we talk about our favorite memes and share pictures and share vegan recipes and all kinds of other good stuff. We're wrapping up reading Andreas Malm and Wim Carton's The Long Heat very soon. I think next week. So you've kind of missed the boat on this this particular reading group, though there is another one starting very soon where we're reading Richard Horsley's The Liberation of Christmas. So that's going to be rad too. You can read a book with us, is all I'm trying to say. Maybe that's not a good selling point, but you never know. Our intro music is by Mari Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Logical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late in Jackson.